Welcome to Module 5. This is where the rubber meets the road. We've built a pool of candidates and it's time to start vetting them, and that's what this module is all about. Now, the rookie mistake is to use unstructured interviews that just waste a lot of time. Unstructured interviews are the most relied upon, but the most misused because they're not highly predictive. Now let's talk about why that is. For starters, and get this, 81% of candidates lie to your face during interviews. So we're going to have to use references to validate what they tell us in the first place. But also, unstructured interviews are inconsistent, which means you're asking different questions to different candidates at different times, and that makes it impossible to compare across candidates. The other reason that interviews are only partially useful is our own biases. Now, studies have shown that attractive candidates are perceived to be more intelligent. Taller candidates are perceived to be great leaders. Deeper voice candidates are perceived to have higher integrity. Introverted candidates are perceived to be poor leaders. But the biggest one of all is confirmation bias. And let me explain what that is. We as humans identify and prejudge someone within 60 seconds. That's just the way that we're wired. We have to decide and kind of make sense of, is this an enemy or a friend? And so the same happens in your interviews. So in the first 60 seconds, you prejudge this candidate and then spend the rest of the interview trying to confirm that original hypothesis. And there's ways to overcome that, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. But despite all these things, there's still no better way than interviews to narrow the field from the long list to the short list. Now, maybe artificial intelligence will solve this one day, but for now, we're going to use structured interviews. What I mean by structured interviews is to ask the same questions in the same sequence at the same time. And that will help us see how a candidate is trending over the course of their career, kind of like how a story unfolds. It also lets us compare one candidate against other candidates objectively. And finally, structured interviews let us build pattern recognition so that we get smarter with each additional interview that we do. And it's never too late to begin this. Now, the reality of interviews is that they're really time-consuming, and you simply cannot afford to invest that much time with everyone. So we progressively spend more time with promising candidates. Now, there are 3 types of interviews that help us do this. For starters, there's the phone screen interview, and you probably do something like that today. We're going to start with about 20 viable candidates. We don't know much about them, but it's something, and we're going to narrow the field down to 5. And then we start with those 5 and progress to the career deep dive interview and the DNA interview. And you're going to master all 3 by the time we're done with this module. So let's start with the phone screen. Again, you probably do something like this today, but I think I can make it a lot more effective for you. First of all, how do you decide who to phone screen in the first place? A lot of my clients will just pick up the phone and start having conversations. And I like to be a little bit more strategic than that, because even 20 minutes is a lot. So, first of all, employee referrals and personal referrals. They always go right to the top of the stack. I don't care if it's just a name. If it's got someone's stamp on it, I want to talk to that person. So they always come first, even if it's just as a courtesy to the employee. But you may be surprised. Now, for the rest, again, I don't want you to just start calling. I want to be strategic about it. Sometimes all we have to go on is their LinkedIn profile or an old resume or a business card. So how do we prioritize this outreach? Well, just like in marketing, let's think about who our ideal target is. We all have a compensation budget for every role, and you usually know that up front. You don't want to decide at the end of the process, only have to redo the whole search. What I found works best is to target individual candidates that are a 20 to 30% difference from the current comp that you're planning to offer. You want to see a 20 to 30% increase in compensation, in scope, in challenge. When you target these individuals for whom this role is a great move, they're much more likely to be interested, engaged, and frankly, they have something to prove. When you target people that are already at this level, in a sitting situation where they're sitting with that title, with that same compensation, you have to ask yourself, why would the person make that move in the first place? It doesn't make sense. So we've got to think about who we want to target. And quite often, we think about this up-and-comer, and they actually have less risk than someone who's taking a lateral move. Why would they take it? Which is really the safer bet, I guess, is what I want you to think about. Turns out that sitting VP of marketing versus that up-and-comer director of marketing, this person may actually be lower risk. So in my experience, that person wins almost every time. They just have a lot to prove. So again, be mindful about who you're targeting for this particular position. Now, the interview guide. In the online briefcase, I've included the exact questions and why I ask every single one, so you're going to become very familiar with it. And it's okay to have it printed out and sitting in front of you during interviews. I've got clients that do this all the time, but soon it's going to become second nature and you'll rattle off these questions top of mind. I want to point out a few things about the interview process, things that I want you to pay extra attention to. The first is what I call the 3-10 rule. I need to be able to assess the candidate's performance. And it may be a bit unfair to job hoppers, but I've got a good reason for doing that. I need to understand whether the individual had to make decisions, eat their own cooking, live with those decisions for a whole business cycle, and then iterate and adjust based on the results. And when a job hopper has moved around every 6 months, 12 months, I just can't make that assessment. So the 3-10 rule allows for this, because I'm looking for someone that has had no more than 3 places of employment over the past 10 years. They could have had one misstart, one misstep, one bad fit, that's okay, but a series of those, and it gives me a big red flag. Next is referenceability. This is almost as important as the actual references themselves. I want to be able to verify what I've been told during the interview process. And so rather than wait until the end, I ask right up front to make sure they're going to be referenceable. I also want to make sure they're affordable. I'd rather find out now, and instead of at the end of the process, after I've fallen in love with the candidate, only to find out that we're off by $50,000 and I can't afford them. Now, some people will tell you that you can't talk money so early in the process, and I've learned that that is a complete myth. 99% of candidates don't want to waste their time either, and they're happy to discuss compensation with you even on the first call. Now, here's a little bit of a twist. Until last year, you simply asked current compensation. How much are you earning? But in an increasing number of states and cities, that's no longer legal. And the reason is that the government is rightfully trying to erase salary discrimination by gender. And I'm all for that. So instead, we have to ask the question a bit differently. And we have to understand, what are your compensation expectations in your next role? That's totally fine. I can also ask, well, how do you envision your compensation would be structured in your next role? That's fine too. Another area that I want to evaluate early in the process: in what way are you unfulfilled in your current role? Is there anything in your current role that's missing or that you could wave a magic wand and change? And what that tells me is there are areas of discontent, and I jot those down because I'm going to circle back later to remind them that their boss treats them poorly or micromanages them, or they have a 90-minute commute. Now, if they're actively looking, of course, it's a little easier. And can I just ask, what's been missing from the roles that you've been looking at? Now, the goal of the phone screen is to decide if it's worth investing 5 hours of your team's time. So the goal is to narrow the field from about 20 candidates to about 5. And when in doubt, throw it out. A lot of people will say, well, I've only got 3 candidates, I might as well throw in one more. I don't view it that way. 5 hours of my team's time is a lot. So unless I have reason to believe this candidate checks all the boxes, they don't go to the next step. One more thing around the process. You want a batch process, which means process candidates in parallel, not serial. And what that means is, when I'm on a phone conversation and it's gone well, I don't commit on the spot and say, hey, I'd like for you to come in for 5 hours of interviews, because that next candidate I talk to may be even better. I want to evaluate the group as a total first, so I have some basis of comparison. And then I circle back to the ones that I want to invite to the next round. I've avoided many hours of poor interviews that way. Now, the first 60 seconds of the conversation are everything, especially if there's someone that's not looking for a job at all. So it's an outbound outreach. And I just kind of introduce myself and I say, hey, I'm Jeff Hyman, and I'm leading the search for a remarkable product manager. and I saw your LinkedIn and it really struck me, and I had no reason to think that this might be the right timing for you, but it's really a tremendous role, and I'd like to discuss it with you for 15 minutes. Would you be open to a short conversation? 9 times out of 10 they say, yes, of course. Great, I'm happy to tell you all about it, but before I do, could you just give me a 60-second overview on kind of what you're up to these days? I went through your LinkedIn profile, but they're not always totally up to date, so maybe that's just a good place to start. Now, the reason I frame it this way is it introduces me and the fact that I've got an opportunity to discuss, but I get them talking first. I want to hear a little bit about their current role before I spend all this time explaining the company and the opportunity, only to find out I know it's not a good fit. So again, I'm very conscious of how I spend my time. Now, if it's an inbound or an active applicant, it's a little bit easier, right? Because they've already applied to the position, so they know I am calling. But I still explain the position and the company and my role in the process, and I still ask for that 60-second overview on what they're currently working on. And I listen really intently on that. I can tell the scope of their role, their perspective, are they happy and engaged in their current role, and some of the reasons that they might be looking to move on. So this 20-minute phone screen can save you many hours down the road. Let's talk about your homework. First of all, print out and review the phone screen interview guide that's located in the online briefcase. You're going to use this time and time again. Second of all, make notes about your current role that you selected. What are some of the essential things that you think you want to uncover in those 20 minutes to decide if it's worth investing 5 hours of your team's time? Now it's time to go deep, and I'll see you in the next lesson.